Everyone laughed when a single dad inherited an abandoned castle. They called him crazy, certain there was nothing inside but dust and cobwebs. But when he went down into a secret basement hidden beneath a crumbling library and turned on his flashlight, everything changed. What he found underground didn't just turn his life upside down, it silenced everyone. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The morning began, like so many others, in the slow, monotonous rhythm of Andrew Collins' life. The air smelled faintly of oil and rust, the residue of long nights spent in the cramped auto shop that never seemed to sleep. The hum of the old refrigerator in the trailer filled the silence as he poured himself a cup of bitter coffee that had been sitting on the counter since yesterday. Outside, the world was gray and half awake. The same line of tired houses stretched along the highway, their roofs stained with the memory of storms. His hands, rough and scarred from years of repair work, trembled slightly as he lifted the cup. He had been a mechanic for almost 15 years, a job that kept food on the table, but never enough to breathe easily. Since his wife's death, Andrew had carried the heavy, unspoken weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Every morning he told himself the same quiet promise: just one more day, keep going for Lily. His 12-year-old daughter was the one spark of color in a life that had long faded to gray. She was bright, imaginative, too gentle for the world around her. He often found her sitting by the window of their small trailer, sketching whatever her mind conjured. A lighthouse standing against a storm, an old mansion hidden in the mist, sometimes even a castle by the sea. The trailer was small but orderly. Lily's school drawings hung on the refrigerator door beside bills and grocery lists. There were only 2 rooms: the narrow bedroom that Andrew had turned into hers, filled with paper and paint, and the other, barely large enough for his worn-out bed and a small desk. The bathroom door didn't close properly, and the ceiling leaked when it rained, but it was home. It was theirs. That morning, the mail arrived unusually early. The sound of the postman's truck faded down the road, leaving behind the faint rustle of envelopes sliding into the metal box. Andrew stepped outside, still in his grease-stained shirt, and pulled the small stack of letters out. He expected the usual: utility bills, advertisements, maybe a reminder from the bank. But in the middle of the pile was something strange. A thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with dark red wax. His name, written in precise black ink, stretched across the front: Andrew Collins. There was no return address, only a faint embossed symbol, an unfamiliar crest with a tower on a hill. He tore it open with the edge of his thumb, careful not to rip the paper. Inside lay an official letter, the kind written by people who lived in rooms with polished wood and quiet carpets. It was from a law firm in Boston, representing the estate of one Professor Arthur Collins, recently deceased. The letter stated in clipped legal terms that Andrew had been named the sole heir to an old property known as Holmgrave Manor, located on the northern coast of Maine. The inheritance, it said, included the main house, surrounding grounds, and all remaining possessions of the late professor. For several long seconds he stared at the words, unable to absorb them. Professor Arthur Collins? The name meant nothing to him. He had never met anyone by that name, nor heard of Holmgrave. It had to be a mistake. He checked the address again. His name, his exact home address. His mind filled with questions that had no answers. He carried the letter inside, set it on the counter, and read it again and again. It was as though his hands belonged to someone else, turning the pages, touching the embossed seal. He remembered something faint. His father, years ago, late at night, after too much whiskey, muttering about a madman in the family. A scientist, an inventor, someone who had locked himself away to chase impossible dreams. He had laughed it off then, the drunken talk of a man bitter with regret. But now, staring at the letter, he felt an uncomfortable stirring of that memory. Lily came into the kitchen, her hair still messy from sleep, clutching her notebook to her chest. She noticed the envelope immediately and asked what it was. Andrew smiled, though his stomach tightened. "Just something strange," he said, folding the papers carefully. "Looks like we've got a long-lost relative." He didn't tell her more, not yet. But that night, after she'd gone to bed, he sat for hours under the weak yellow light of the kitchen lamp, reading every word until the lines blurred. The letter was clear. He had 30 days to appear in person, and sign the acceptance papers. If he didn't, the estate would revert to the state. It sounded absurd. Him, a worn-out mechanic with calloused hands and an empty savings account, suddenly the owner of a manor, a castle by the sound of it. Yet something in him refused to throw the letter away. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe curiosity, or maybe it was that small, foolish part of the human soul that still hopes for a miracle, even after the world has beaten it dull. For 3 days he tried to ignore it, but every time he looked at Lily, her notebooks filled with drawings of old houses and stories of imaginary places, the thought returned stronger. What if it wasn't a mistake? What if this was a chance, not for him, but for her? A place to start over, away from the noise and the endless cycle of work and bills. By the end of the week, he called the number listed in the letter. A polite voice confirmed everything. Yes, the inheritance was real. Yes, he was the sole heir. Yes, the property was large, but had been abandoned for decades. The voice on the phone recommended that he visit soon, as the building was in delicate condition. The next morning, Andrew requested a few days off from the garage. His boss, a heavy man with grease on his arms, frowned but didn't argue. "You've earned it," he said, waving him off. "Just don't expect the castle to have Wi-Fi." Andrew almost laughed. They packed lightly, a few clothes, food for the road, and Lily's sketchbook. The old pickup coughed and shuddered as it started, as if protesting the idea of such a long trip. The journey took them north, through long stretches of pine forest and narrow roads that twisted like ribbons between the hills. The air grew colder, heavier with salt as they approached the coast. The further they drove, the quieter the world became, until it seemed they were leaving time itself behind. Lily pressed her face to the window, eyes wide as she watched the scenery change. The sunlight glinted on the ocean far below, and the fog rolled in from the cliffs like a slow, breathing creature. Andrew said little, his hands steady on the wheel, but inside he was uneasy. The directions from the law office were old-fashioned, almost poetic. Turn left at the split oak, follow the road until the sea appears on your right, then climb until the iron gates come into view. The GPS stopped working miles ago. By the time they reached the final stretch, the road had turned into little more than a dirt path, flanked by wild grass and low stone walls. Then through the fog, they saw it. The gates of Holmgrave Manor stood crooked and half-rusted, one hanging loose from its hinges, the other leaning like a weary sentinel. Beyond them, a long driveway disappeared into a tunnel of overgrown trees. The sky had turned a deep pewter gray, and the wind off the ocean carried the smell of salt and decay. Andrew stopped the truck and stared. The silhouette of the manor loomed ahead, vast, angular, and covered in thick ivy that clung to the walls like a living skin. The towers rose high above the treetops, their stone faces streaked with the dark stains of time. Windows glinted faintly in the fading light, though he couldn't tell if they reflected the sun or something within. Lily whispered, almost reverently, "It's beautiful." He didn't answer right away. To him, it looked less like beauty and more like a challenge, something ancient, wounded, and waiting. The place had a presence, the kind that pressed against your ribs and made the air feel thinner. Yet despite the unease twisting in his stomach, he felt drawn to it, as if something unseen had reached out from behind those cold walls and taken hold of him. They drove through the open gate and up the gravel path, branches brushing against the sides of the truck like fingers. The engine echoed through the stillness. When they stopped in front of the grand entrance, Andrew cut the ignition. The silence that followed was complete, broken only by the sound of the distant waves crashing below the cliffs. The door of the manor was massive, made of dark oak bound with iron. He hesitated, then tried the handle. It didn't move. Reaching into his jacket, he pulled out the brass key the law office had sent along with the letter. The metal was cold and heavy, carved with the same crest he'd seen on the envelope. When he slid it into the lock, it turned smoothly, almost eagerly, and a deep metallic groan echoed through the hall as the door swung open. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and age. The faint light from the doorway revealed a vast entrance hall with stone floors and a sweeping staircase that curled into the darkness above. Torn curtains hung limply from tall windows, and the faint outlines of murals could be seen beneath centuries of grime. Lily stepped past him, her eyes wide. Her footsteps stirred little clouds of dust that danced in the beams of light breaking through the cracks in the roof. Andrew's heart beat faster. The place felt alive, but not in a way that brought comfort. It was as though every wall was watching, every shadow listening. He took a deep breath and reminded himself that it was just a house, old, abandoned, and heavy with stories. They wandered through several rooms, each one revealing more fragments of a forgotten life. A dining hall with a long table still set with cracked china. A library with shelves of books swollen from damp. A study filled with yellowed papers and the smell of old ink. The further they went, the stronger the feeling grew that they were intruding on something sacred or cursed. As the sun began to set beyond the gray horizon, the last light filtered through the broken windows, painting the walls in shades of gold and shadow. Lily sat on the floor, sketching quickly, trying to capture the outline of the grand staircase before the light vanished. Andrew watched her, small, fragile, but glowing with wonder, and felt something shift inside him. For the first time in years, he saw a spark of hope. Maybe this place wasn't just a burden. Maybe it was an invitation. When the last light faded, he closed the heavy doors, sealing them inside with the whispering echoes of the house. Outside, the sea roared beneath the cliffs, relentless and ancient. Inside, the silence was total. He felt the key still warm in his pocket, as though it pulsed with the faint heartbeat of the past. That night, as they settled on the dusty floor of what once must have been a grand sitting room, the air heavy with the scent of salt and stone, Andrew couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. Somewhere, deep within the walls, something stirred. Not hostile, not welcoming, but aware. And as he drifted toward uneasy sleep, one thought echoed through his mind, quiet and inescapable. Some places choose their people, not the other way around. He didn't yet know that Holmgrave Manor had been waiting for him, and for Lily. The wind outside rose and howled against the windows, and the shadows stretched across the ceiling like the slow breath of something waking. In the morning, they would begin exploring in earnest, but for now the castle simply listened, patient, ancient, and alive. The morning arrived muted and colorless, filtered through the mist that rolled in from the sea. Andrew woke to the sound of the wind moving through cracks in the old walls. It sighed and whispered like a living thing, carrying with it the scent of salt, decay, and wet earth. For a moment he didn't remember where he was. Then he opened his eyes to the massive stone fireplace looming over him, and the faint outline of Lily curled in her blanket near the broken window. The castle surrounded them in silence, patient, heavy, watchful. He stood slowly, his back stiff from sleeping on the cold floor. The light slanted through the fractured glass, painting patterns across the dust. Everything looked ancient but strangely preserved, as if time here had its own slower rhythm. He looked around and wondered how long it had been since another human had lived within these walls. The air felt old, burdened by memory. He could almost hear the echo of footsteps that were not his own, long faded but still clinging to the stone, like a ghost that refused to leave. Lily stirred, rubbing her eyes, her hair tangled. She smiled when she saw him. "Morning, Dad," she said softly. Her voice was the only sound of the present in that ancient place, a reminder that they were still alive, still themselves. She looked around the vast hall with a kind of wonder that only a child could have. "Can we explore today?" she asked, already clutching her sketchbook. He hesitated. The practical part of him wanted to get back in the truck and drive away before the engine rusted like the rest of the property. But another part, deeper, quieter, wanted to understand the place. Something about the manor pulled at him. It wasn't just curiosity, it was a sense of unfinished business, a feeling that his being there was no accident. They ate a simple breakfast from what they'd brought. Bread, peanut butter, bottled water, sitting on the steps of the grand staircase. The silence of the house was immense, but not empty. It felt like it was listening. When Andrew set down his mug, the sound echoed for a long moment before fading into the stillness. He began exploring, while Lily followed with her sketchbook. Each room told a different story. The dining hall was enormous, lined with tall windows, now clouded with grime. A chandelier hung above the long table, its crystals dull with dust, but still faintly beautiful when the light struck them. In the library, books covered the floor, their pages swollen and yellowed. The shelves themselves stretched to the ceiling, built from dark wood that smelled faintly of mold and salt. Lily brushed her fingers along the spines, leaving trails through the dust, as if she were touching the veins of a sleeping creature. The farther they went, the more Andrew sensed that the house was not dead, merely dormant. The air seemed to pulse softly with each step. Sometimes when he turned a corner, he caught the faintest whiff of something out of place, a whiff of perfume, or the metallic scent of electricity. He told himself it was imagination, the mind's way of filling silence. Around noon, they walked down to the lower floors. The kitchen was vast, with a stone hearth big enough to roast an animal. Copper pots hung from hooks, tarnished green with age. There were jars of long-forgotten preserves turned black, and a door leading to what must once have been the servants' quarters. Everything was coated in a thin layer of grime, but underneath it all was the sense of precision. Whoever had lived here had done so with discipline, maybe even obsession. After hours of exploring, they found the first real trace of a person who might have once cared for the place. On a small table near the back entrance lay an oil lamp, clean of dust. It was as though someone had touched it recently. Andrew frowned and tested it. There was still a bit of fuel inside. It couldn't have lasted untouched for 40 years. That evening, after the sun dipped below the cliffs, they drove down the hill to the small fishing village a few miles away. The road twisted between trees and stone fences, finally opening to reveal a handful of wooden houses huddled around a harbor. The smell of seaweed and fish filled the air. A single diner still had its lights on. Inside, they met a man named George Mercer, gray-haired, stooped, but sharp-eyed. When Andrew mentioned Holmgrave, the old man's expression changed subtly. He set down his coffee cup and studied them as though measuring their courage. "So you're the one," he said finally. "I heard someone was coming to claim it. Been a long time since anyone set foot there." Andrew asked what he knew about the place, but the man hesitated, glancing toward the empty tables before leaning closer. "That house was built before most of these folks were born," he began. "Belonged to Professor Arthur Collins. Brilliant, they say. Obsessed, too. He kept to himself, especially after his wife and boy died. Some folks said he was working on something unnatural, machines that could think or record thoughts. Said he was chasing immortality." The man laughed softly but without humor. "Never saw him again after the war. One night, the hill lit up like lightning struck it, and then nothing. They say he vanished. People started talking. Some swore they could hear music from up there, long after he was gone. Others said it was the house itself that breathed, like it had a soul trapped inside." Lily listened with wide eyes, fascinated. Andrew thanked him and paid for their coffee, but the man's words clung to him like sea mist. As they drove back up the dark road toward the manor, headlights cutting through the fog, he couldn't shake the feeling that George Mercer had been telling the truth in a way he hadn't meant to. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The wind rose again, rattling the shutters, and somewhere in the vastness above them, a door creaked slowly open and closed. Andrew sat up, listening. The sound came again, faint, deliberate, like footsteps on stone. He checked on Lily, who was already asleep, her sketchbook still in her lap. He told himself it was the wind, that old buildings had voices of their own, but deep down he knew this was different. When dawn broke, the air inside the house felt heavier, charged. He decided to check the rooms on the upper floors, the ones they hadn't yet seen. The staircase groaned under his weight as he climbed. At the end of one hallway, he found a locked door, heavy and iron-bound. The handle refused to turn. He tried pushing, but it didn't move. What struck him most was the lock, new and polished, utterly out of place among the centuries of decay. He stepped back, frowning, his breath visible in the chill air. The sense of being watched grew sharper. When he turned, the hallway behind him was empty, but he could have sworn the air trembled, the faintest vibration, as if the house itself had just taken a shallow breath. Later that day, while clearing fallen plaster in the library, Lily found something hidden beneath the great rug that covered the center of the floor. A hollow sound echoed when she tapped her shoe against it. Andrew helped her roll the rug aside, revealing a metal trapdoor set flush with the wood. It had a small iron ring, rusted but still intact. He hesitated before pulling it open. The hinges groaned, and a damp smell of earth and oil rose from below. A narrow staircase spiraled downward into darkness. He fetched a flashlight from the truck and descended first, each step echoing like a heartbeat. The air grew colder. At the bottom, he found a room unlike any other in the house. It was made of solid stone, its walls lined with strange devices, glass tubes, copper coils, and old electrical panels covered with knobs and switches. Tables stood in perfect order, their surfaces covered in papers, sketches, and glass beakers still half filled with dried residue. In the center of the room stood something massive, covered by a heavy canvas tarp. When he pulled it back, the beam of his flashlight fell upon a metal cylinder taller than a man. Its surface was engraved with intricate patterns and faint symbols that glimmered as the light moved. He didn't touch it. Every instinct told him not to. Near one wall, written in careful, deliberate strokes, was a phrase in faded ink. Memory is energy. Energy is eternal. Andrew felt a chill crawl down his spine. The words didn't sound like a scientific motto. They sounded like a confession. That night, after they returned to the upper floors, Lily asked him what he thought it meant. He told her it was probably just a philosophical note left by her ancestor. But her eyes searched his face, and he knew she could see he didn't believe his own words. As they sat by the dim light of the oil lamp, Lily suddenly said she didn't want to leave yet. She said she dreamed the house had a heart that beat under the floor, and that it wasn't angry. It was lonely. Andrew laughed softly and stroked her hair, but inside unease twisted tighter. Outside, the fog had thickened until the ocean was only a dull roar below the cliffs. The trees bent in the wind like dark figures bowing to something unseen. The lamp flickered once, twice, then went out, leaving them in shadow. For a long time, Andrew sat awake, listening. He could hear the deep groans of the structure settling, the whisper of the wind in the chimneys, and something else, something subtle, rhythmic, like the distant toll of a bell far beneath them. When he finally closed his eyes, he dreamed of the phrase painted on the wall. In the dream, the letters glowed like molten gold, and beneath them, the metal cylinder pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. He saw the outline of a man standing beside it, tall, gaunt, his face lost in shadow, and behind him, another smaller figure, a child. The next morning when he woke, the dream clung to him like fog. Lily was already awake, sitting by the window sketching the western tower. The air felt different, still heavy, but almost expectant. Andrew tried to shake off the unease, but as he glanced toward the library door, he thought he saw it move ever so slightly, as if breathing. He told himself it was only the draft. But as he stepped into the hall, the words of the old man in the diner came back to him, quiet and certain. That house breathes, son. It remembers. Andrew looked up the grand staircase that wound into the shadowed upper floors. Somewhere beyond that locked door he knew the truth was waiting, and beneath his feet, in the cold chamber below, something had begun to stir. The morning rose in pale shades of gray, and the mist lay thick over the cliffs as if the sea itself had climbed onto the land. Inside the manor, the air was colder than before, still heavy with the scent of old stone and oil. Andrew woke early, before the light had fully reached the high windows. The dream of the night before still clung to him, so vivid that he could almost feel the hum of that strange machine beneath his feet. He looked toward the library, where the hidden door lay under the carpet, and felt a pull stronger than curiosity, something darker, like gravity itself, urging him to descend again. Lily was awake too, sitting cross-legged on the floor with her sketchbook, drawing by the faint light that leaked through the window. She had captured the outline of the western tower, but in her drawing, faint lines traced through the walls, like veins, leading down to something buried deep below the earth. When Andrew asked her about it, she only shrugged and said she had dreamed it. He didn't tell her that he'd dreamed the same thing. They ate breakfast in silence, the kind of silence that feels full, as if it were listening. Afterward, Andrew gathered a flashlight, gloves, and a small hammer from the truck, then lifted the carpet again. The air that rose from the open trap door was cool and damp, but beneath it was a faint vibration, almost imperceptible. Lily wanted to come, but he made her promise to stay upstairs and call if anyone came to the house. She nodded reluctantly, watching him vanish into the shadows. The descent seemed longer this time, the air thicker. At the bottom, he turned on the flashlight, and its beam caught the glint of glass, copper, and rusted steel. The laboratory waited as if nothing had changed, but the dust seemed disturbed. Footprints faintly visible, too small to be his. He crouched to look closer, tracing them with his gloved hand. They led toward a desk covered in papers and books. His stomach tightened. He wiped the dust from one of the notebooks and opened it. The pages were filled with small, precise handwriting, charts, and sketches of human figures, with lines connecting the head and chest to symbols that looked like circuits. At first, he thought it was physics or biology, but the longer he read, the less certain he became. The notes spoke of the transfer of memory, the persistence of the self, and energy as identity. Each entry grew more frantic, more personal. The handwriting wavered. One line was underlined 3 times. The body decays, but thought remains pure energy. Energy cannot die. On the last page there was a date, written shakily, November 4th, 1952. Below it, a single sentence. The container is complete, awaiting activation. Only the air may finish what I began. Andrew sat for a long moment, the silence pressing against his ears. The words felt impossibly alive, as if the professor had written them not 70 years ago, but yesterday, waiting for him to find them. He turned slowly toward the machine in the center of the room. It towered above him, made of polished metal dulled by age, its surface engraved with symbols that caught the light in strange ways. Some resembled constellations, others mathematical spirals. Around its base, copper wires led into the walls, like roots burrowing into the foundation. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and brushed away the dust from one of the panels. Beneath his hand, the metal felt faintly warm. The flashlight flickered once, twice. He looked around quickly. The air had shifted, charged with something unseen. The hum grew stronger, pulsing like a heartbeat. He backed away, nearly tripping on a fallen chair. Then through the static hum, a faint sound reached him, a whisper too soft to make out. It came from the direction of the cylinder. He froze, every muscle rigid. The whisper came again, clearer this time. A voice, faint but unmistakably human. It said his name. He stumbled back up the stairs, slamming the trapdoor shut behind him. His breath came fast, his hands slick with sweat. Lily was waiting in the hall, wide-eyed. She said she had heard something too, a low ringing sound like bells underwater. He didn't tell her what he'd heard. Instead, he forced a smile and told her everything was fine. But he knew something in the house had changed. The air felt alive, and not in a way he could understand. The rest of the day passed in uneasy quiet. Andrew tried to distract himself with small tasks, fixing a window hinge, sweeping some of the debris from the hall, but his mind kept drifting to the laboratory below. Every creak of the old floors made him flinch. Lily seemed restless too. She kept wandering from room to room, as if searching for something. When he called her for lunch, she didn't answer right away. He found her standing in the long corridor that led to the western tower, staring at the locked door with the new iron lock. She asked him if he had gone inside. He said no, that the lock was too solid to break without tools. But when she turned to him, her expression was strange, almost disappointed. "It's waiting for you," she said softly, and then walked away before he could respond. That night the wind rose again, stronger than before. Rain lashed against the windows and thunder rolled far out at sea. The storm seemed to awaken the manor. The walls groaned and distant doors banged as if unseen hands moved through the corridors. Lily fell asleep early, her sketchbook beside her bed. Andrew sat by the fire in the old kitchen, the flames casting long shadows that moved like breathing shapes. He couldn't shake the image of the cylinder, the way the metal had felt alive beneath his hand. Then came the scream. He was on his feet before he even realized it was Lily's voice. It came from above, sharp, terrified, cut short. He ran through the hall, his flashlight trembling in his hand, and took the stairs 2 at a time. The corridor was darker than before, the walls seeming to close in. Her room was empty. The blanket was thrown aside, her sketchbook open on the floor. He called her name, again and again. No answer. The air felt colder now, biting. Then he heard it, the faint rhythmic sound of footsteps coming from below. He followed them to the library. The trapdoor was open. The light from his flashlight barely reached the bottom of the stairs, but he saw her footprints in the dust, small, bare, leading straight to the laboratory. His heart pounded as he descended. The machine stood uncovered, and the air hummed with a low, resonant vibration. The flashlight beam swept across the room, catching the glint of metal, the shimmer of moisture on the walls. "Lily!" he called, his voice echoing. Then he saw it. The cylinder was open. Its interior glowed faintly, as if holding the last breath of a dying fire. Behind him, somewhere deeper in the shadows, came the faint, steady toll of a bell. He turned slowly. A narrow passage he hadn't noticed before extended from the far wall, leading to what looked like an archway. The bell sounded again, and he followed, moving through the damp corridor until it widened into a small stone chapel. Candles, long dead, lined the walls, and at the front stood an altar carved from black rock. In front of it, motionless, stood Lily. Her hair hung loose, her nightgown damp with moisture from the air. She was staring at the altar, whispering words he couldn't hear. The light from the cylinder pulsed faintly through the open passage, flickering across her face. He called her name, but she didn't respond. When he touched her shoulder, she turned, and for a heartbeat, it wasn't her eyes looking at him. They were older, colder, filled with something vast and knowing. Her lips moved, and when she spoke, the voice that came out was not hers. "You came back," it said. "You are the heir. The work must be finished." Andrew stumbled back. "Who are you?" he whispered, though the answer was already forming in his mind. The figure that was both his daughter and not his daughter smiled faintly. "Arthur Collins," the voice said. "This house is my vessel. She is the key." The candles along the walls flickered to life all at once, as if drawn by an unseen breath. The air trembled, the vibration rising from the floor through his bones. The voice continued, calm and unhurried. "I preserved what could not be lost. The body dies, but consciousness endures. Through her, through you, my blood will awaken the continuum." Andrew shook his head, horror clawing at his throat. "You can't have her," he said. "You can't use her." "She is already chosen," the voice replied. "You cannot undo what has begun." The glow from the passage behind him brightened, flooding the room with cold silver light. The sound of the bell grew louder, deeper, until it vibrated through the walls. Andrew reached for Lily, but her body stiffened, her eyes unfocused. For a moment her lips trembled as if she were fighting to speak. Then she whispered, weak and frightened, "Dad!" That was enough. He lifted her into his arms, ignoring the surge of cold that burned his skin, and ran. The air seemed to push against him, the light chasing him through the corridor. The vibration now a roar. He reached the stairs, stumbled, caught himself, and climbed until his legs burned. When he slammed the trap door shut, the sound echoed like a gunshot through the house. He collapsed on the floor, clutching her. The humming stopped. The silence that followed was complete, so complete it felt wrong. Lily stirred weakly, her eyes fluttering open. She looked confused, disoriented. "Dad, I had the strangest dream," she murmured. He held her close, not trusting himself to speak. When morning came, the storm had passed. The sea below the cliffs was calm, gray, indifferent. But Andrew knew nothing would ever be calm again. He went back to the laboratory once. Later that day, when Lily was sleeping, the cylinder was closed again. The warmth was gone, but the faint hum, that impossible heartbeat, had returned, so quiet he could almost convince himself it wasn't there. He stood in the doorway, staring at the machine, at the words on the wall that now seemed less like philosophy and more like prophecy. Memory is energy. Energy is eternal. For the first time, he truly believed them. And as he turned away, he could have sworn he heard the faint echo of a man's voice whispering from somewhere deep within the walls. Not angry, not triumphant, but waiting, patient as stone, certain as time. Morning came without light. The air hung heavy with the remnants of the storm, damp and charged, as though the night had not ended, but only paused to gather strength. Andrew woke to the slow, steady sound of water dripping somewhere in the house. Each drop echoed through the stone halls like a clock ticking down to something inevitable. Lily still slept, her small body curled under a blanket, her face pale and peaceful in the weak gray light that filtered through the broken window. For a moment he allowed himself to believe it was over, that the strange voice, the humming machine, the cold presence that had filled her eyes the night before, had all been a nightmare born of exhaustion and fear. But when he looked toward the library door, he knew the lie couldn't hold. The air was too still. The silence was not rest, but anticipation. He spent the early hours pacing through the hall, trying to make sense of what had happened. His mind searched for rational explanations. Electromagnetic interference, hallucination, suggestive dreams. Anything to anchor him in the world he understood. Yet the more he tried to reason it away, the more the memory returned in vivid detail. The glow of the cylinder, the voice that had spoken through his daughter, the bell that had no source but seemed to come from the very bones of the castle. When he touched the wall beside the staircase, it was faintly warm, as if something behind it was alive. Lily awoke near midday. She didn't remember the night clearly, only fragments. Light, a voice, the feeling of floating. She wasn't frightened. If anything, she seemed oddly calm, as if the experience had left her both emptied and at peace. When she smiled at him, he felt a deep ache of fear and love. He couldn't tell whether she was truly herself. Her eyes looked the same, but something inside them was quieter, deeper. The day stretched long and slow. Outside, the sea roared under the cliffs, and the clouds hung low and bruised. Andrew tried to keep busy, fixing what he could, sealing the window, checking the old generator in the shed. But every sound seemed amplified. At times he thought he heard faint music, the same melody Lily had described before, drifting from the western tower where the locked door waited. When he went to check, the corridor was empty, the lock untouched. Yet he could feel the hum through the soles of his shoes. As evening approached, he knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever the machine was, whatever the professor had done, it wasn't finished. The house felt charged like a coil wound too tightly, waiting for the final spark. He couldn't risk it taking her again. After dinner, though neither of them ate much, he told Lily to stay in her room and keep the lamp burning. He tried to sound calm, but she seemed to understand what he intended. She didn't argue. "You'll fix it," she said simply, and her certainty cut through him like a knife. He kissed her forehead, then turned toward the hall, carrying only his flashlight and the crowbar he had kept near the door. The descent to the basement felt longer this time. The air grew colder with each step, the smell of metal and damp earth stronger. When he reached the bottom, the faint glow from the machine was already visible, shimmering through the cracks in the tarp he had thrown over it. He pulled it away and stared at the thing that had become his enemy, his inheritance, his curse. The engravings along its sides seemed to shift in the light, and as he approached, the hum deepened, pulsing like a heartbeat that was not his own. The journals still lay on the tables, the last one open to the final entry. He forced himself to read it again, the professor's words written in a desperate shaking hand. Consciousness does not die, it transfers. The container is the bridge between memory and matter. When the air arrives, the circle will close. Andrew's breath came ragged. He had to end it, whatever the cost. He circled the machine, searching for a way to disable it. The wires that fed into the walls looked ancient but intact, protected by layers of insulation. He traced them to a control panel half buried under debris. The dials were marked with symbols instead of numbers, and when he touched one, a small jolt ran through his fingers. The air around him vibrated faintly, and he heard the whisper again, close this time, almost intimate. "You don't understand," it said. The voice was calm, weary, like someone long dead who had forgotten how to fear. "You would destroy what you are." Andrew clenched his fists. "You've had your time," he muttered. His own voice echoed hollowly in the chamber. He grabbed the nearest wire and pulled hard. Sparks flared, and the lights along the machine flickered, but the hum continued, now faster, louder. "Stop," the voice said. It came from everywhere. The walls, the floor, the very air. "You will undo everything." "Then let it be undone." He tore another cable free. The hum became a roar, and the metal cylinder trembled. Dust rained from the ceiling. For a moment he thought it would collapse, but then, through the noise, came another sound. A single clear note, like a bell struck deep underwater. The same note that had called him before. It grew louder, closer, until it seemed to pulse inside his chest. Then the machine changed. The panels along its sides slid open with a slow, mechanical grace, revealing glass surfaces within, faintly lit from behind. On them appeared images, flickering like old film, of faces, rooms, memories. He saw people he didn't recognize, scenes from other times. A woman with kind eyes reading by candlelight, a boy building something at a workbench, soldiers marching across snow. And then he saw himself, standing in this very room, staring into the light. The reflection of his face looked older, worn, but unmistakable. He stepped back, his heart pounding. The voice softened, almost pleading now. You are part of it, Andrew. The bloodline carries the code. I preserved us all. You cannot destroy it without destroying what remains of your own memory. The machine's glow grew brighter, filling the room with cold silver light. The temperature dropped. His breath came out in clouds. He raised the crowbar, gripping it so tightly his knuckles whitened. You had your chance, he said. It ends now. He swung the bar down onto the nearest coil. The sound was deafening. A sharp crack followed by a burst of blue-white light. The machine screamed. A metallic shriek that felt alive. Sparks flew and one struck his arm, burning through his sleeve. He ignored the pain and struck again, and again until the light flared so bright he couldn't see. The roar built to a single blinding crescendo, and then everything went dark. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on the floor. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of ozone. The hum was gone. For the first time since they had entered the house, there was true silence. Heavy, final. He tried to sit up, his muscles shaking. The flashlight had rolled away, but the faintest glow still lingered from the machine's core, dying like an ember. He watched as it dimmed and finally went out. Then came a voice, but not from the machine. It was softer, fading, a whisper that seemed to come from within his own mind. You have done what I could not, it said. Thank you. He closed his eyes and listened as it faded completely, leaving only the sound of his own heartbeat. He didn't know how long he lay there before he heard footsteps above. Light, hesitant. Lily's voice called his name, trembling but alive. He found his strength and climbed the stairs. When he reached the main hall, she was waiting, clutching her lamp. She ran to him, and he caught her, holding her tightly, feeling the warmth of her against the cold that still clung to him. It's over, he whispered, though he wasn't sure if it was true. She looked up at him, her eyes clear, no longer distant. I heard him, she said softly. He said goodbye. He didn't ask how. He only nodded and led her toward the window. Outside, the storm clouds were breaking apart, revealing a horizon streaked with pale gold. The sea, restless and wild the night before, now lay calm and glassy beneath the dawn. The house felt different, lighter somehow, though still vast and solemn. They spent the rest of the morning walking through the rooms, as if reacquainting themselves with a space that no longer belonged to the dead. The chill had lifted. Dust motes danced lazily in beams of sunlight that had not touched these walls in decades. The portraits on the walls no longer seemed to watch but merely existed, silent witnesses to what had passed. Yet as he moved through the hall, Andrew could not shake the sense that something remained. Not a threat, not even a presence, but a memory that refused to fade. When he passed the old grandfather clock near the entrance, he noticed its pendulum moving again, slow and steady. He hadn't touched it. That night, they slept in the kitchen beside the fireplace. For the first time, the house did not groan or whisper. The only sound was the crackle of wood and the distant murmur of the sea. Lily fell asleep quickly, her face peaceful in the firelight. Andrew stayed awake, watching the flames and thinking about the professor, about what kind of man had loved his work so much he had refused to let it die. He could almost feel a trace of sympathy now, the loneliness that must have driven such obsession. Perhaps, he thought, the man hadn't wanted to live forever. Perhaps he had only wanted to be remembered. As he drifted towards sleep, he heard something faint, not the hum, not the whisper, but a soft sigh, like a long exhale of relief. The sound came from deep within the walls, and though it might have been nothing more than settling stone, he imagined it was the house itself finally breathing out after holding its breath for half a century. When the morning sun rose, it painted the walls with gold. The castle that had once felt like a prison now seemed almost alive with quiet peace. The nightmare was over, and yet he knew the past never truly vanished. It lingered, reshaped, waiting for its next telling. He walked outside and stood at the edge of the cliffs, the wind sharp against his face. The sea stretched endlessly before him, gray and gleaming. Behind him, Holmgrave stood strong against the light, no longer haunted but awake. He whispered a silent farewell to the man whose legacy he had ended, and in that moment he thought he heard a distant bell ring once, clear and soft, carried away by the wind. When he turned back to the house, the windows caught the sun, and for an instant they gleamed like eyes, warm and alive. The house had exhaled, and now it rested. The system was gone, the hum silenced, but the memory, like all energy, endured, folded gently into the stone, the walls, and the blood of those who remained. Spring came quietly to the coast, softening the air around the cliffs and washing the manor in a new light. The storms had retreated far out to sea, leaving behind the smell of salt and wet stone. The house no longer creaked as it once did. The constant chill that had clung to its walls seemed to have lifted, replaced by something warmer, more human. For the first time since arriving, Andrew Collins felt that the silence of Holmgrave was no longer heavy but calm, like a long-held breath finally released. Months had passed since that night in the basement, when the machine's glow had dimmed for good. The days that followed had been filled with slow, deliberate work. Andrew repaired what he could and sealed what he couldn't, learning the rhythm of the old building, the way the morning light slipped through the tall windows of the east wing, the way the sea wind hummed through the broken arches of the towers. He had stopped thinking of Holmgrave as a ruin and started to think of it as home. Lily adapted faster than he did. Children have a way of seeing change, not as loss, but as transformation. She had claimed a small tower room as her own, where she kept her paints and sketchbooks, covering the walls with drawings of the ocean, of birds that nested in the cliffs, of the castle itself as it slowly came back to life. Some days Andrew would find her on the balcony, hair whipped by the wind, describing her latest idea for the house, a library for the village children, a garden where the courtyard now lay in ruin. Her laughter carried through the halls like music, and each time he heard it, something inside him loosened. But despite the peace, echoes of the past remained. There were moments when he would pause, feeling watched, only to realize it was the quiet weight of history pressing close. In certain corners of the house, he could still feel the pulse of old memories. Not threatening, but persistent, as though the walls were whispering stories to anyone willing to listen. The difference now was that he no longer feared them. The presence in Holmgrave had changed. It no longer sought to control. It had become part of the air, woven into the place like the smell of salt and wood smoke. It was Lily who first suggested opening the house to others. She had overheard the villagers in town, how they still spoke of Holmgrave as a haunted place, a reminder of tragedy and madness. Maybe if they saw it, she said one morning over breakfast, they'd stop being afraid. Andrew smiled at her idea but didn't dismiss it. He knew she was right. The house deserved more than superstition. It deserved to be seen as what it had become, a sanctuary, not a secret. So he began to plan. He cleared the main hall of debris, polished the banisters, and repaired the old lanterns that lined the entrance. He reopened the library and built shelves from the wood salvaged in the stables. Slowly the locals began to visit, at first out of curiosity, then with genuine warmth. Farmers brought old photographs. Widows came with boxes of letters or trinkets belonging to those long gone. Andrew listened to their stories and stored them carefully in the library. What began as a gesture of gratitude grew into something larger. Holmgrave became known as the House of Memory, a place where the past could be preserved, not feared. Each evening, when the visitors had left and the last lamp had been extinguished, Andrew would walk through the rooms alone. He often stopped by the grand staircase, where he could hear the sea through the cracks in the windows. Sometimes he would sense a faint echo, a soft chime, a vibration through the floorboards. But it no longer frightened him. He would simply nod, as though acknowledging a presence he now understood. "We're still here," he would whisper, "but it's all right. Rest now." Lily thrived in the new rhythm of life. Her days were filled with school, with painting, with laughter. Yet she too carried traces of that night. There were times when she would pause in the middle of drawing and stare into the distance, as if listening to something far away. Once she told Andrew that she dreamed of the professor, not as a shadow or a voice in the dark, but as an old man smiling in sunlight, standing on the cliffs, watching over them. He didn't doubt her. There were mysteries that didn't need proving. The restoration of the manor stretched over 2 years. The roof was rebuilt with slate brought from the quarry, and the broken stained glass windows were replaced with new panels, each one bearing patterns inspired by Lily's drawings. Ocean waves, stars, and spirals like those carved into the professor's machine. Andrew hired local craftsmen, giving work to people who had once spoken of the castle with fear. Now they laughed and called it our project. He liked that phrase. It meant the house belonged not just to him, but to everyone who stepped inside. On quiet nights when the world was still, Andrew sometimes sat by the fireplace and read through the professor's recovered journals. Many pages had been damaged beyond repair, but the remaining entries told the story of a man consumed by the fear of forgetting, not for himself, but for humanity. The professor's final words struck him hardest. "Memory is the only immortality worth seeking." Andrew understood them now. The machine had been born not out of madness, but out of love. A desperate, misguided love for what time steals from all men. He closed the book and stared into the flames, feeling something like forgiveness rise in his chest. The years ahead passed quietly, the manor filled with light, with the hum of ordinary life. Lily grew taller, her eyes reflecting both her mother's gentleness and the quiet strength she had found here. Sometimes she and Andrew hosted gatherings for the townsfolk, where stories were read aloud and music filled the halls that had once echoed only with wind. The laughter of children replaced the groan of old machinery. Every corner that had once been haunted by silence now carried a voice, a trace of life. Yet the memory of what they had endured remained, not as a wound, but as a foundation. Andrew had come to believe that the house itself had chosen them, not to trap them, but to be saved. He often thought back to that night, to the moment the machine had died. He remembered the voice that had thanked him, fading like the last note of a song. In some quiet way, he missed it. There had been a strange companionship in that dialogue between the living and the dead. But perhaps that was what legacy meant, the merging of what was gone with what continued. One late afternoon, as the sun began to sink into the horizon, Andrew and Lily stood on the balcony of the restored West Tower. From there, they could see the village, the sea, and the endless stretch of sky that turned orange and gold. The wind carried the cry of gulls and the scent of salt. Lily leaned on the railing, her hair caught in the breeze. "Do you remember," she said, "when everyone thought we were crazy for staying?" Andrew smiled. "I remember," he said. "They were probably right." She laughed, the sound bright and effortless. "Do you care?" He shook his head. "Not anymore." They stood in silence, watching the light fade. Below them, the sea shimmered like liquid glass, and the first stars began to appear. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang. Not the toll of warning or sorrow, but a gentle, familiar sound that seemed to carry across the years. Andrew closed his eyes, listening, and in that moment he felt no fear, no weight, only connection. When night fell, they returned to the great hall, where the portraits of long-dead ancestors watched from their frames. The largest of them, the stern face of Professor Arthur Collins, no longer seemed severe. The flicker of firelight softened his eyes, giving them an almost human warmth. Andrew paused before it and bowed his head slightly. "You were right," he murmured. "Memory does endure." Later, when the house had gone quiet, he walked to the small chamber he had sealed years ago, the place where the laboratory once pulsed with energy. It was empty now, just bare stone and dust. In the corner, he had placed a single candle, which he lit once each year on the anniversary of that night. The flame flickered, casting trembling shadows across the walls. For a brief instant, he thought he saw the outline of a man standing in the doorway. Tall, stooped, hands clasped behind his back. But when he blinked, the vision was gone. The candle burned steady. He left the room and locked the door, not to hide it, but to honor it. Some secrets were meant to rest. In the years that followed, Holmgrave became known far beyond the small coastal village. Scholars visited to study its architecture. Artists came for inspiration. They said the manor had a strange peace about it, as if it remembered those who stepped inside and greeted them like old friends. Andrew never spoke of what had happened beneath its floors. He simply smiled and told them the truth that mattered, that the house had once been broken and that love had rebuilt it. On Lily's 10th birthday after their arrival, they held a celebration in the Great Hall. The room was filled with music and laughter, and the walls glowed with the reflection of candles. Neighbors who had once whispered about ghosts now danced on the very floor they had feared to enter. As the night wound down and guests began to leave, Andrew stood by the doorway, watching them go with quiet pride. He felt the presence of those who had come before, not haunting, but blessing. When the last guest had gone, he and Lily climbed to the highest balcony. The moon hung over the sea, bright and full. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You think it's really over?" she asked. He looked out at the endless expanse of water, the faint shimmer of waves in the moonlight. "Maybe not over," he said. "Maybe just begun again, in a different way." She smiled at that and said no more. Together they watched the dawn approach, the first hints of pink brushing the edges of the clouds. The wind off the sea was cold but gentle, carrying the scent of salt and something else. Something faintly metallic, almost like memory. Inside, the house stood still and silent, but not empty. Its walls, once burdened with grief, now held laughter. Its floors bore the marks of living feet, its halls the echoes of music and voices. It had changed as they had. The machine was gone, but its purpose had not been lost. The castle had become what it was always meant to be, a vessel not for immortality, but for remembrance. And as the first light of morning touched the towers, Andrew thought of the professor's final message, written long ago. "For the heir who finds this, you were worth waiting for." He looked at his daughter, radiant in the dawn, and knew that the promise had been fulfilled. Holmgrave no longer waited. It had been found, restored, and awakened, not by science or power, but by love, by the stubborn faith of two souls who refused to give up on a dream. The waves crashed against the cliffs far below, steady as a heartbeat, and the castle stood firm above them, no longer haunted, no longer hollow. The house of memory had finally become what it was always meant to be, a home. If this story kept you watching till the end, make sure to subscribe, because the next one might surprise you even more. Don't stop here. Check out our other incredible stories of secrets, legacies, and second chances. And if you felt something while watching, share this video so others can experience it too.